All right, so, yeah, we always see those samurai, on horseback and swords
Yeah.
drawn, like, right in the heat of battle, right?
Oh, yeah.
But, like, what happened to, like, their spirit and code when, like, those battles kind of faded away,
Yeah.
That's what we're diving into today.
Awesome.
It's called Hagakure, or the Book of the Samurai.
Right.
And it's really a collection of thoughts and observations from this samurai named Yamamoto Tsunetomo.
Okay.
And kind of an interesting thing about him is that he never actually saw combat.
Wow.
So
Ooh.
it's kind of like, imagine this a guide for living the samurai way in a time of relative peace.
Yeah, a very interesting perspective to come from.
Right. So
Yeah.
what's so compelling about Hagakure is that it emerges from this like very specific historical moment, right?
Right.
The Tokugawa shogunate had brought about like this long period of peace in Japan. And so he's like grappling with this fundamental question. Like, how does the essence of the samurai, their discipline, their dedication, how does that survive when there isn't a war to define them? He's trying to distill the way of the samurai for an era that looks very different from the one before.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of almost takes on a new meaning, almost.
Right. Exactly. And that's what we're going to be doing today in this deep dive for you, the learner.
Okay.
We want to explore this way, as Tsunetomo kind of laid it out for us, and we want to dig beneath the surface of those popular images of the samurai.
Right.
I mean, we've all seen them romanticized samurai movies and all that, right?
Yeah, tons of them.
So we know that you come from all sorts of backgrounds, so we're going to guide you through all this material.
Okay, great.
We're going to highlight all the core ideas without getting bogged down in every last detail, because there's a lot in here.
Right.
So-
Yeah, think of it as like we're focusing on a few key areas that he really goes into detail on.
Okay.
Like we'll start with kind of this idea of death in the way of the samurai.
Okay.
And then we'll move into what it means to be a retainer serving a lord and what qualities that requires. And then finally, all this really interesting practical wisdom and guidelines for conduct that he gives.
Right.
It's really a comprehensive look at what their life was like. And honestly, I think you might be surprised by some of the things that still kind of apply to us today.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's jump right in then.
Right.
So one of the most striking statements in Hagakure is the way of the samurai is found in death. Now, that sounds pretty extreme.
Right.
What's the deeper meaning behind that for Tsunetomo?
So it's important to keep in mind that this is not like him literally saying to go out and seek death.
Yeah.
Instead, he's talking about a deep acceptance of the fact that we're all going to die.
Right.
And his argument is that if you can live every day as if you were already dead, then you become liberated.
Okay.
Liberated from fear, obviously, the fear of dying.
Right.
But also just from fear of failure and from making mistakes.
Okay.
It allows you to really just put all of yourself into your duty without hesitation.
So it's almost like a form of mental preparation, or like a radical way of like focusing on the present moment and your responsibilities.
Yeah, exactly. And he talks about this idea of like setting one's heart right every morning and every evening. So like this constant process of self-reflection, and acknowledging that you're not going to live forever.
Right.
That's the foundation for living this like blameless life he talks about and achieving success in your obligations.
Okay, now that sounds pretty profound.
It is,
Yeah.
and you can even see how that kind of relates to like some modern ideas today
Right.
around mindfulness and things like that.
Living intentionally.
Exactly.
So a lot of Hagakure is dedicated to like the role and the qualities of a retainer.
Right.
So someone serving a lord. And for Tsunetomo, what is like at the absolute core of that responsibility?
Well, I think for him, the highest ideal for a retainer is to earnestly place importance in his master.
Oh, okay.
And he actually lays out this whole hierarchy of usefulness for retainers. And it might surprise you, but he puts wisdom and talent at the very bottom.
The lowest tier.
Yeah, the lowest.
That's
Yeah.
not what you would expect.
I know, right?
So what qualities does he kind of elevate above intellect then?
Well, it's really about dedication and commitment to the master.
Okay.
It doesn't matter how smart you are. If you're not dedicated to your lord, then you're not going to be a good retainer.
So like even someone who isn't like super gifted can be a good retainer if they have that deep-seated determination to always act in their lord's best interest.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
And he also emphasizes this kind of historical bond.
Okay.
The obligation to one's ancestors who also served the same family for generations.
Right.
And if you happen to be born into like a prominent family that serves a lord, then it's important to deeply respect that master.
So it sounds like selflessness is really central to his view of what a good retainer is.
Totally. And he even brings up the 4 vows of the Nabeshima samurai to get this point across. And he says that like genuine, insightful wisdom comes from selfless thought. From putting the needs of your master above your own.
Right.
And he really contrasts this with self-interested contemplation,
Okay.
which he says just leads to perverse thoughts, and it never ends well.
Interesting. So he also offers some advice for people who might not feel like they're particularly intelligent or astute themselves.
He does.
What's his take on seeking guidance?
So he says that if someone realizes that they lack this like true intelligence, then they should try to get advice from someone known for their good sense. So essentially a selfless and honest advisor is vital in this situation, and he gives an example of this lord who would always go to his younger brothers for advice on like personal and official matters.
Okay.
And it really helped him avoid any like big mistakes.
Interesting.
So yeah, it's all about being humble and looking to others for perspective when you're not sure.
Right. So the ideal retainer is always thinking about how to best support their lord, almost anticipating their needs and always acting in their favor.
Exactly. And he even says they should entrust matters of good and evil to him.
Wow.
And renounce self-interest.
So like you're completely giving yourself over.
Pretty much.
To your lord.
Yeah. And he actually criticizes those who like abandon their lord when they retire.
Okay.
To try to gain favor with the new power coming in.
Right.
He considers that very disgraceful.
Wow. So what does he advocate for then?
Well, he talks about the unexpected strength of the person who has basically mentally given up their life already in service to their lord. They're no longer afraid,
Right, because they've already
accepted it.
Given up their life for their lord.
Exactly. So they're the most reliable.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So, and he also gives some advice on offering one's opinions.
Yeah.
And it's not just about like speaking freely.
Right.
It's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it's about knowing when to speak. So he says it's vital to carefully assess whether the person you're talking to is actually open to hearing what you have to say. So cultivate trust, understand their perspective, choose the right time and method. Is it a formal letter or a private conversation?
Okay.
He even suggests like subtly addressing their shortcomings by first talking about your own faults.
Wow,
they're more receptive.
That's clever.
Yeah.
So there's like a real art to this kind of communication.
There is.
Okay, well, let's move on to some of this practical wisdom that's woven throughout Hagakure.
Okay.
And there's this analogy that I found really interesting. It involves fish and duckweed.
Oh, yeah.
And it kind of illustrates a point about governance.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
So he uses this image of fish, thriving in water that also has duckweed in it.
Okay.
And his point is that sometimes overlooking minor imperfections or issues, particularly amongst the common people, can lead to greater peace and stability overall. So if the water's like too pristine, too clean of everything, then the fish representing the populace won't actually survive.
Wow.
So it's a very pragmatic perspective.
That's interesting. So sometimes things don't need to be absolutely perfect for people to thrive.
Right.
He also issues a warning against those who are all talk and no action.
Oh, yeah.
Those who can smooth things over with clever words, but avoid putting in real effort.
Totally. And he cautions against these affairs that are finished cleverly with words alone, and this tendency to kind of shy away from tasks that require real exertion.
Right.
He wants young samurai to really take concrete action rather than just relying on rhetoric or like superficial solutions.
So there's also this idea of no mind in Hagakure.
Right.
And it sounds very much like some Eastern philosophical ideas.
It does, yeah.
So what does Tsunetomo mean by that?
Well, he quotes this priest named Tannen, who says that no mind is just a mind that's pure and that lacks complication. And then Lord Sonori goes on to say that in the midst of a single breath where perversity cannot be held is the way.
Okay.
So the main takeaway here is that this like mental clarity requires continuous effort and discipline.
Right. So it's not passive.
No, not at all.
It's an active striving for purity of thought.
Right.
And he also mentions when your own heart asks. And it seems like he places a lot of importance on this internal questioning.
He does. He really holds this phrase in high regard. He compares it to the Nembutsu, which is this central Buddhist prayer.
Okay.
And he says that it's an essential guiding principle. It's almost like an internal compass that points you towards truth. And he
Neutral idea.
contrasts that with just like superficial cleverness.
Okay.
He argues that someone who might seem dull-witted,
Right.
but whose heart can honestly be examined with this phrase, is actually a more reliable indicator of their genuine intent.
Okay.
So it's about being sincere
Right.
over just being like witty or clever.
So he consistently values genuine feeling and intention
Yes,
over outward appearances or quick thinking.
exactly.
Now, he also touches on this idea that the world around us might not be as solid as we perceive it.
He does, yeah.
So he uses this term gen, which translates to like illusion or apparition,
Right.
and he compares the entire world to a marionette show.
It's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, so what do you think is the point he's trying to make with that?
Well, I think he's trying to tell us to detach from outcomes a little bit and to maybe have like a less rigid interpretation of events.
Okay.
You know, just recognize that they're all kind of temporary in a way.
Transient.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, this is another fascinating point and maybe a bit counterintuitive, but he says that hating injustice and rigidly adhering to righteousness can actually lead you astray.
Yeah.
And that the true way is in a higher place than righteousness.
Yeah, it's a very interesting idea.
So can you unpack that a bit for us?
Okay, so he's saying that striving for like this narrow definition of what's right can actually be very limiting.
Okay.
Can have negative consequences that you don't expect.
Hmm.
And he believes that the true way,
Hmm.
this highest form of wisdom and conduct, isn't always like black and white.
Right.
It can be much more subtle and harder to really get just through thinking about it.
Right.
And he says that finding this way often means getting advice from others,
Okay.
even people who haven't mastered it themselves,
Yeah.
because they can offer you a fresh perspective.
So bouncing ideas off of other people can prevent you from getting too fixated on your own notions of what is right.
Exactly.
And he also presents this kind of hierarchy of men, a progression of understanding and self-awareness.
He does.
So what are the key levels he identifies?
So it starts with the people that he considers worthless.
Okay.
And that's because they're unaware of their own shortcomings.
Okay.
Then there are those who recognize that they have deficiencies,
Right.
but they still remain ineffective. Then further up are those who are proud of their abilities.
Right.
But the highest level, according to Tsunetomo, is someone who has this like profound humility, someone who has the look of knowing nothing.
Wow.
And he is always aware of how much he doesn't know,
Right.
and he's always trying to learn more.
So never thinking that they've reached the final destination.
Exactly. And he brings up this quote from Master Yagyu
Okay.
that says that you achieve true victory by defeating yourself,
Interesting.
not an external enemy.
So it's a never-ending journey of self-improvement.
Totally.
It's lifelong commitment to learning and refining yourself.
Absolutely. And he really pushes this idea of daily progress.
Okay.
You know, always striving to be more skillful, more aware than you were the day before.
Now, there's this really interesting contrast in the maxims from Lord Naoshige and Master Ite
Right.
regarding matters of great and small concern.
Yeah.
So Lord Naoshige says to treat matters of great concern lightly,
Yes.
and Master Ite says that matters of small concern should be treated seriously.
Right.
So how can we kind of reconcile these contrasting views?
Well, it's about perspective and preparation.
Okay.
If you take the time to consider and resolve big problems beforehand,
Okay.
then you can deal with them without so much anxiety when they actually come up. On the other hand, if you ignore small details,
Yeah.
they can blow up into these huge problems later on.
Right.
So it's all about strategic thinking.
Foresight and attention to detail.
Yes.
He also warns against, this cultural insecurity, like looking down on your own traditions and just blindly copying others.
Yes. And he actually says that your unsophisticated and unpolished nature is a great treasure,
Okay.
and that just imitating others is superficial.
Okay.
He calls it a sham.
So be yourself, basically.
Yes. Stay true to yourself. And he uses this funny example of someone who comes home after being away for a long time,
Okay.
and they get made fun of for adopting a different dialect.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
And, for a text coming from this warrior culture, there's this progressive idea about giving people second chances
There is.
after they make a mistake.
Yeah.
So there's this story about a council that was hesitant to promote this man
Okay.
because he had gotten into a drunken brawl in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But someone argued that if they were to get rid of everyone who had ever made a mistake, there would have almost no one left.
Right.
And their logic was that a person who has made a mistake and learned from it
Right.
would be a lot more prudent and careful in the future.
Exact.
And they even went so far as to guarantee his future conduct
Wow.
based on the fact that he had already made this mistake.
That's a really powerful statement.
Yeah, it's surprisingly forward-thinking.
It is.
Now, when he talks about revenge, his view is very direct, almost uncompromising.
Right.
So he says that the essence of revenge lies in simply forcing your way into a place and being cut down.
Wow.
So he says, don't overthink it.
Yeah.
Don't count how many enemies there are.
Don't try to figure out your chances.
Yeah, don't worry about your chances of success. Just do it.
Wow.
And he also emphasizes the role of prior preparation for a samurai.
Yeah.
So through like reading and listening to the wisdom of others.
Right.
So why is this so important?
Because when the moment comes to act, there's not always time to sit and think and plan.
Right.
So you need to have this foundation of understanding that you can draw on in the moment.
So you're ready to act.
Yes.
And he says that the way the samurai involves this constant awareness that the future is unpredictable.
Right.
And you need to keep learning.
You always need to be learning.
To be ready for whatever comes.
Exactly.
Now, even in the face of inevitable defeat,
Yeah.
he advocates for this really defiant action.
He does.
So could you talk about that a little bit?
So even when you know you're going to lose, he says you should still fight back fiercely.
Okay.
Disregard any like tactics or wisdom.
So like, don't even worry about it. Just fight.
He calls it a reckless plunge towards an irrational death. And he believes that this unwavering commitment, even in a losing battle, can kind of wake you up from these illusions of victory and defeat.
Okay.
So you can focus on just dying without shame.
Oh,
That's the ultimate goal.
that's really powerful.
Yeah.
And he also identifies these two things, riches and honor, as potential pitfalls.
He does.
So why are those things bad?
Well, he suggests that remaining in strained circumstances, so without too much wealth or status, can prevent you from being corrupted
Okay.
and led astray by those worldly desires.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's a warning against complacency
Right.
and the bad things that can come with success.
And he also advises against a negative outlook.
He does. He
Yeah.
says if you're constantly focused on what's wrong,
Yeah.
then you're never going to get anything done.
Right.
So you need to focus on what's possible.
So stay positive.
Exactly, and always think this is not enough.
Always striving for improvement. Now, Hagakure is filled with all these like short, almost like aphorisms, these sayings that offer little glimpses into Tsunetomo's philosophy.
It is.
Do any of those stand out to you?
Oh, yeah, tons of them.
Oh.
There's one, if you understand one affair, you will understand 8. So that means like true mastery in one area can help you understand so many others.
Okay.
He also talks about the difference between like a genuine laugh
Okay.
that comes from inner peace
Right.
and a laugh that's forced.
Right. So like one that's not really sincere.
Right. He talks about eye contact
Okay.
being really important in communication.
So you can tell someone's being sincere.
Exactly.
And he also says to be careful about even small habits because they reveal your character.
Right. Like little things can say a lot about you.
Yeah. And there's this one that really stood out to me where he says
Okay.
that you should act after reading something and maybe even like throw the book away so you don't get caught up in just the ideas.
Wow.
So it's about taking action.
Yeah, and he even like compares reading to this scholarly imperial court and contrasts that with the military prowess of houses like Nakano.
So he values action
Yeah, he does.
over just thinking about things.
Definitely.
So he also gives some advice on appearance
He does.
and daily routines for samurai.
Yeah.
So what are some of those?
Well, he says that a samurai with no group and no horse is not a samurai at all.
Wow. Okay.
So that really shows you how important community and status was
Right.
for them. And then he talks about this kusumono.
What's a kusumono?
So it's someone who's kind of unconventional or rough around the edges.
Okay.
And he actually considers them to be more reliable than someone who's like too refined.
Okay.
And he talks about having a daily routine where you wake up early, you stay clean, and you kind of align your activities with the sun.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he even mentions using a toothpick.
A toothpick.
Yeah, even if you haven't eaten.
What?
Just as a way to maintain proper decorum.
Wow, that's interesting.
Good details.
Okay, and this idea of having a pure and uncomplicated mind,
Right.
he presents that as like the central goal for a samurai.
Absolutely. It's like the foundation for everything else.
So what does that lead to then?
Well, he believes that from that state of mind comes loyalty to your lord,
Okay.
filial piety, bravery in battle,
Right.
and just the ability to do something good for the world. But he admits that it's really hard to maintain that state of mind.
Right, because life is complicated.
Exactly. And he reminds us that true focus is just being present in the current moment.
So not worrying about the plans or the future.
Right, just what's right in front of you.
And he also places a lot of importance on appearance,
Yes.
even in the face of death.
Yeah, and it's not about vanity.
Right.
It's about being prepared.
Oh, yeah.
So even if you know you're going to die, he says you should still die looking presentable. Because if you're found dead looking a mess, then it shows a lack of respect for yourself and your enemy.
So taking care of your appearance is a way of showing respect.
Yes, and it's a reflection of your inner discipline.
And he also warns against what he calls contriving hearts.
Right.
And a lack of duty.
Yeah.
So how are those two connected?
So a contriving heart is a mind that's always scheming.
Okay.
Always thinking about itself.
Right.
And he sees that as the opposite of the selflessness that duty requires.
Okay.
And he says that if you lack that genuine commitment, then you're going to lose self-respect.
Interesting.
Yeah, because you're not living according to the true way.
And he also talks about this interesting idea of learning through imitation.
He does.
Almost like an apprenticeship.
Yeah, like a master and a student.
And he says that you can get better at something even if you're not good at it.
Right.
By copying someone who is.
Right.
So he uses the example of a bad penman.
Right.
Who can improve by imitating a master calligrapher.
Exactly.
And he said that samurai should do the same thing.
They should find people to model their behavior after. But he also cautions that it's easy to pick up bad habits when you're doing that.
So you have to choose your role models carefully.
Yeah, and he also mentions that there weren't a lot of perfect examples of people to copy in his time. So he suggests you can create like this composite ideal.
Okay.
By taking the best qualities from a bunch of different people.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And he even gives instructions on something as simple as delivering a document.
Right.
So how do you do that properly?
So you have to hold it firmly and present it directly to the person and don't let go until they take it.
Wow. So there's like a specific way to do it?
Yeah, it's all about showing respect and responsibility.
So it's symbolic.
Yeah.
Okay, and he seems to have this distrust of people who are good at a lot of things.
Yeah. He says that being versatile in many things is vulgar.
Okay.
And that's because you probably don't have deep knowledge in any one area.
Right, so he values like focused expertise.
Exactly.
Over just being a jack of all trades.
Right.
And he also talks about how a retainer should respond to their master.
Yeah.
Whether they're being given good news or bad news.
Right.
So how should they act?
Well, silence is not good.
Okay.
It makes you look confused.
Right.
So you should always have a response ready. And don't get too excited when you're being praised.
Okay.
Just stay humble and acknowledge that you're not perfect,
Right.
but that you're still committed to doing your best.
Okay, so humility is key.
Yeah.
And he also warns against inconsistency and frivolous behavior.
He does. Yeah. He says that shows that you're not mature and that it will lead to bad consequences.
So stay focused.
Yes.
And he seems to have some reservations about learning itself.
He does. Yeah. He says that it can lead to mistakes if you're not careful.
Okay.
And he says that learning from watching people is better than just reading books. And he gives this example of someone who was arguing about something and then threatened people to make them agree with him.
Wow.
So that shows you how bad it can get.
So being too attached to your own ideas can be dangerous.
Totally.
And he also says to not rely on others too much.
Yeah.
When there's work to be done.
He says just take initiative and do it yourself.
And so don't wait for someone else to do it. And then there's this story about the rainstorm.
Yeah.
And the importance of having a strong resolve.
So he says if you just accept that you're going to get wet in the rain, then you won't be bothered by it.
Interesting.
But if you try to avoid it, then you're just going to get frustrated.
Right.
So it's the same with anything difficult.
Just go into it knowing what to expect.
Right. And make up your mind to do it.
Okay, so have a strong initial resolve.
Exactly.
He also cautions against being too focused on one thing.
Yes.
Like an artist who only thinks about their art.
Right.
And he offers these age-based guidelines.
He does.
So what are those?
So he says you should build up your strength and skill until you're 40.
Okay.
And then by the time you're 50, you should try to settle down into a stable position. So like the first half of your life is for learning.
Right.
And the second half is for using what you've learned.
To establish yourself.
Yeah.
And he also talks about conversations.
Yeah, he says you should be mindful of what you're saying.
Okay.
And always be grateful for the opinions of others.
Even if you don't agree with them.
Even if they're worthless.
Why?
Because it shows that you're listening.
Right.
And that you respect them.
And he keeps the conversation going.
Right.
And he also says that true genius might take a while to develop,
He does, yeah.
so don't rush it.
And he also says that retainers shouldn't be in a hurry to do things
Okay.
because they might mess things up.
Right.
And he says that they'll act rudely
Mm.
and they might seem insincere. So
And,
take your time.
and be thoughtful.
Exactly.
And when it comes to these important warrior tasks,
Yeah.
what does he say a samurai should do?
Well, he says you should resolve that no one else can take your place and that you're always going to be the best.
So always be prepared.
Yes, and cultivate your courage.
And on the battlefield, he has some very direct advice.
Yeah, he says you should just charge right into the enemy lines. Don't wait for anyone else, just go.
So be decisive.
Yeah, and don't hesitate, because
Okay.
that will only make things worse.
And he also talks about just everyday interactions
He does.
and how you should always greet people warmly.
Yeah.
Why is that so important?
It shows respect.
Okay.
And it avoids any awkwardness.